For centuries, Torah scrolls, consisting of the 5 books of Moses written by hand on parchment, have been the heart of the Jewish tradition, revered as the ultimate spiritual treasure, and are believed to be the very word of God. But there's something about them that many are unaware of, a secret hidden in plain sight. These scrolls are written in a completely different script than the original Torah first written by Moses. So who changed the script of the Torah? When did this monumental shift take place, and why? Was it simply a change in style, or was there a deeper, hidden purpose behind it all? Join me as we uncover the untold story of the Torah's script and unravel the secrets behind the transformation of the Hebrew alphabet. When we compare Torah scrolls originating from Jewish communities of vastly diverse geographical and cultural settings, other than minor variations in style, we encounter a remarkable uniformity that is nothing short of astonishing. This uniformity reflects the intricate and complex body of laws governing the writing of Torah scrolls found within the Jewish tradition. In fact, Jewish sofrim, or scribes, are required to adhere to such a high level of precision that even one letter written incorrectly is enough to render an entire scroll invalid for use. Yet, it is precisely these strict guidelines that call our attention to the fact that the script currently used for writing Torah scrolls is very different than the original Hebrew script, commonly referred to as Paleo or Ancient Hebrew, which was used during the First Temple period. In fact, the beautiful calligraphy script called Stam, that's in use today, actually has more in common with modern Hebrew characters. Now, before we go any further, if you haven't yet watched our first study on the subject entitled Secrets of the Hebrew Alphabet Origins, it would be beneficial for you to watch that first video so that you will have a better understanding regarding the origin, history, and development of the Hebrew alphabet, and how it relates to the script in which the original Torah was written. But the question that arises is, how is it possible that the highly detailed and strictly regulated script currently used for the writing of Torah scrolls, as well as other sacred texts, looks nothing like the Paleo-Hebrew script used during the First Temple period, let alone its predecessor, the original pictographic alphabet, the so-called Proto-Sinaitic script, which we discussed in the first video? This question is further strengthened by the great sanctity and reverence ascribed specifically to this later script by the sages of Israel, a sanctity that, according to the Jewish mystical tradition, is directly related to the very shape of the characters, each one of which is believed to represent and express infinite avenues of spiritual meaning and significance. Why is it that such profound spiritual significance is derived particularly from a script which reflects a relatively late development and hence stands further away in time from the revelation at Sinai and the writing of the original Torah by Moses? And what could be the reason that the traditional script with which Torah scrolls were written for hundreds of years was replaced with another? To begin, let us again refer to the fundamental teaching found in the Talmud and tractate Sanhedrin, which we related in part 1, focusing on the question concerning the nature of the script in which the Torah was originally written. Initially, the Torah was given to the Jewish people in the Hebrew script and the sacred language. It was later given to them again in the days of Ezra in Assyrian script and the Aramaic language. Based on archaeological evidence, we can infer that what the Talmud refers to as the Hebrew script should include both the pictographic Proto-Sinaitic or Proto-Canaanite script used during the 2nd millennium BCE, the script that would have been used to write the original Torah, as well as what is known as Paleo-Hebrew or Phoenician script, which gradually developed from and replaced the former, and accordingly was used to write Torah scrolls during the First Temple period, from the 10th to the 6th centuries BCE. The teaching further elaborates that after the Torah was given to the Jewish people again in the so-called Assyrian script, the ancient Hebrew script was effectively discarded and left in the hands of the Kutim, better known as the Samaritans. But what is the historical reality behind the rest of this rather enigmatic teaching? What is this so-called Assyrian script that replaced the Hebrew script? And what does the teaching imply when stating that the Torah was given again? Is there a second Torah? And also, who exactly were the Samaritans? And why was the original Hebrew script left to them? Long before it was referred to in the Talmud, the term Assyrian script was first mentioned by Greek historians such as Herodotus, Thucydides, and Xenophon, who referred to it as Assyria grammata, literally meaning Assyrian characters in ancient Greek. However, counterintuitively, this so-called Assyrian script is not a reference to the Akkadian cuneiform famously used by the Assyrians, but rather to the Aramaic script. Aramaic actually belongs to the same Northwest Semitic language group as Hebrew, and the two indeed share many commonalities. It was originally spoken by the ancient Aramean people who lived in the area which today comprises modern Syria. Initially, Aramaic was written in a script virtually identical to the Paleo-Hebrew and Phoenician scripts. However, during the 8th century BCE, the script began to quickly evolve and developed unique characters of its own. This development, driven by expert scribes writing upon parchment, involved simplifying, straightening, and reducing many of the lines used to write the alphabetic characters, until eventually many of them could be written efficiently with no more than 2 strokes of a quill. Shortly thereafter, the Aramean city-states were conquered one by the Neo-Assyrian Empire, and in 732 BCE, the greatest of them, the kingdom of Aram Damascus, fell to King Tiglath-Pileser III. Assyria's domination of the region in antiquity is echoed to this day in the etymology of the word Syria, reflected in the Greek Surya or Asuria, which are in turn likely derived from the Akkadian term Asurayu, meaning Assyrian. Similarly, the reason the Aramaic script was called Assyrian script is because as the Assyrians had slowly become acquainted with Aramaic and its user-friendly efficiency, initially through trade and commerce, and to a greater extent following their conquering of the Aramean kingdoms, they had begun to adopt it as an administrative tool and means of communication between the vast regions of their empire. Soon, both the Aramaic language and writing system had begun to spread throughout the region, until it had eventually assumed the status of a lingua franca and became the international language of the ancient Near East, a status it continued to hold during the dominance of the subsequent Babylonian Empire. By the mid-6th century BCE, the Achaemenid Persian Empire had emerged as the world's new superpower, ruling over expanses of land the size of which no empire had ruled before. And like the Assyrians and Babylonians before them, the Persians too had adopted the Aramaic language and writing system as an efficient means of communication to be used alongside their antiquated cuneiform system. This in turn helped Aramaic spread even further. Now the influence of the Aramaic language had spread throughout the entire Middle East, from the land of Israel in the west to Egypt in the south, and as far as the area of Afghanistan and northern India to the east. It was only during the centuries of Hellenistic and Roman domination, followed by the conquests of Alexander the Great in the 4th century BCE, that Greek had begun to replace Aramaic as the official administrative language of the ancient Near East and had gained much popularity. However, even during this time, Aramaic had still maintained its status as the most commonly spoken language throughout the region, until finally being replaced by Arabic, following the abrupt Muslim conquests during the 7th century. Now the teaching regarding the changing of the script used for writing Torah scrolls can begin to make some sense. According to this teaching, the replacing of the Paleo-Hebrew script with the Aramaic or Assyrian script occurred during the time of Ezra, and indeed this time frame coincides with what we know from historical and archaeological sources. By Ezra's time, during the 5th century BCE, the Jewish people, many of whom were exiled from Judah by the Babylonians, came increasingly under the influence of the Aramaic language and had naturally adopted it along with its script, which began replacing the Paleo-Hebrew script used during the prior centuries. In 538 BCE, Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, issued his famous edict in which he granted permission for the Jews in the Babylonian exile to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. And so, as the Jews began the return to Zion, in what marked the beginning of the Second Temple era, they brought the Aramaic language and script back with them. But according to the teaching, not only was the script of the Torah changed during the time of Ezra, but it was changed by Ezra himself. Rabbi Yosei taught, Ezra was great enough for the Torah to have been given through him to the Jewish people, had Moses not already preceded him. And even though the Torah was not given through him, the script of the Torah was changed by him. Ezra, better known as Ezra the scribe, was an eminent Torah sage of distinguished priestly descent who, together with his contemporary Nehemiah, led the Jewish people during the dawn of the Second Temple period. The book of Ezra describes how he had traveled from Babylon to Jerusalem after being commissioned by King Artaxerxes I as an administrator of the newly established Jewish presence in the land of Israel, and given an official royal decree affirming his leadership and legal authority to judge according to Torah law. But why did Ezra replace the traditional ancient Hebrew script that had been in use for hundreds of years with what seems essentially to be a foreign script? As recorded in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, when the returnees of Zion arrived back in their homeland, they settled in the region of Jerusalem and its surroundings, in what became known as Yehud Medinta, a semi-autonomous Jewish province under the rule of the great Persian Empire. The Jews, who were naturally eager to return to their former way of life, restore the ruins of Jerusalem, and rebuild their beloved temple, were faced with many difficulties and adversities. To begin with, only a small fraction of the Babylonian exile, many of whom were of the less distinguished classes, had heeded the call to return to Zion. Secondly, not only did the Jews return to devastation and ruin, but they did so only to discover that many of their lands, especially the fertile areas, had been seized by various foreign populations. Most notable among these foreigners were the Samaritans, who became the dominant opposing force to the Jewish people and their efforts to rebuild Jerusalem and the temple. The Samaritans, referred to in the book of Ezra as the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin, had initially expressed interest in participating in the rebuilding of the temple, but were refused by the Jewish leadership for reasons that will soon be understood. Following this refusal, the Samaritans took revenge by sending an official defamation letter to the Persian king. This letter consisted of slander, lies, and false accusations against the city of Jerusalem and the Jews, alleging that they were plotting a rebellion. The Samaritans' actions indeed paid off, and the construction efforts of the temple were subsequently halted by the Persian authorities for another 18 years. Indeed, the adversities faced by the returnees to Zion were not only physical but spiritual as well. The book of Nehemiah recounts, "In those days I saw in Judah people treading winepresses on the Sabbath, and bringing stacks of grain and loading them on donkeys, and also wine, grapes, and figs, and all types of loads, and bringing them to Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. Also in those days I saw the Jews who had married Ashdodite, Ammonite, and Moabite women, and half their children were speaking Ashdodite, and they did not know how to speak Hebrew. Similarly, scriptures relate how, when Ezra first arrived in the land, only to discover that distinguished Jewish men had been marrying Gentile women, he literally pulled out his hair, tore his garments, and sat appalled until the evening, when he finally fell on his knees in prayer and confession. "O my God, I am ashamed and blush to lift my face to thee, my God, for our iniquities have risen higher than our heads, and our guilt has mounted up to the heavens." Ezra understood that the assimilation problem was merely a symptom of a greater underlying issue plaguing the Jewish people. It was the dire outcome of their disconnection from their biblical heritage, and reflected the early stages of what, if left unchecked, could become a total extinction of their way of life, and even worse, the forgetting of their covenant with God. Indeed, Ezra was now more determined than ever to complete what he had set out to do in the first place. For Ezra had set his heart to study the law of the Lord, and to do it, and to teach his statutes and ordinances in Israel. Ezra then instituted a series of laws and guidelines that would help strengthen the bond between the Jewish people and their heritage, including designating specific days for public readings of the Torah. One such reading, an event recorded in chapter 8 of the book of Nehemiah, stands out as a pivotal moment marking the initiation of the renewal of the covenant between God and the nation of Israel. This event, which occurred on Rosh Hashanah, shortly after the rebuilding and strengthening of the walls of Jerusalem under the guidance of Nehemiah, can be seen as a spiritual watershed event wherein the Torah foundations of the nation of Israel were likewise renewed and strengthened. The account describes how the people of Israel gathered by one of the gates of Jerusalem, as a Torah scroll was brought out by Ezra, who stood on a high wooden platform, and read from it from daybreak until noon. When closely studying this account, we learned that during this public Torah reading, there were those who were fluent in Hebrew and therefore could listen with understanding, and there were those that needed the reading to be explained or translated. Indeed, by this time, many of the Jews, both in Israel and in the diaspora, had practically forgotten the Hebrew language, and this in turn was a leading cause of their falling away from the commandments, and what necessitated the renewal of the covenant. However, to abide by the covenant, the nation of Israel needed to be familiar with what it entailed. You see, the Babylonian destruction and the exile that followed resulted not only in the gradual loss of the Hebrew language, but also signaled the end to a long tradition of expert Judahite scribes, whose training and function was dependent upon the administration of the kingdom of Judah. This led to a shortage of scribes who were familiar with transcribing Torah scrolls, and accordingly meant that the Torah's laws were slowly being forgotten. After all, in antiquity there was no printing press, let alone the internet, but only handwritten text. Thus, employing both his legal and spiritual authorities, Ezra officially changed the script used for writing Torah scrolls from ancient Hebrew to Aramaic. Moreover, perhaps the term Ezra the scribe may allude not only to the fact that he was a genius Torah scholar who was recognized in the Jewish tradition as having played a pivotal role in canonizing the Hebrew Bible, but also that he was an expert scribe who established a new scribal tradition of transcribing Torah scrolls utilizing the Aramaic script. In addition to changing the script, Ezra also instituted a revolutionary practice, a simultaneous Hebrew-Aramaic translation during public Torah readings. This practice still endures today, especially among Jewish communities of Yemenite descent, who continue to read from the Targum Onkelos, an Aramaic translation composed around the 1st century. For centuries, Aramaic translations like the Targum Onkelos were not written down. They were passed down orally, generation after generation, until they were finally committed to text. The translations were a living, evolving tradition, connecting the past and present, Hebrew and Aramaic, the written word, and the living tradition. It was precisely these two events, the changing of the script and the translation of the Torah to Aramaic, that I referred to in the Talmud's statement that the Torah was given to them again in the days of Ezra in Assyrian script and the Aramaic language. From a historical perspective, Ezra's actions were a brave act of necessity and a strategy of adaptation to a new reality. They were brought about by his deep, prescient understanding of the predicament faced by the Jewish people. By changing the script, Ezra essentially saved the Jewish people and their heritage from oblivion by re-establishing their bond with the Torah and making its procurement readily accessible to all, by making it a Torah for everyone. But what is the meaning of the rest of the teaching, which states that after Ezra changed the script of the Torah to the Assyrian script, the ancient Hebrew script was left to the Samaritans? This refers to the fact that by changing the Torah script, Ezra also created a clear distinction between the Jewish people and the Samaritans. And more importantly, he created a clear distinction between Jewish Torah scrolls, which were now written in the Aramaic script, and Samaritan Torah scrolls, which continued to be written utilizing Paleo-Hebrew characters. In fact, to this day, Samaritan Torah scrolls are still written in a script closely resembling Paleo-Hebrew. But who were the Samaritans? And why was creating a separation between them and the Jewish people so important to Ezra? The story of the Samaritans and their origin is related in 2 Kings, which describes how, in line with the Assyrian population replacement policy, after the northern kingdom of Israel fell to the Assyrians, the Assyrian king, probably referring to Sargon II, exiled the Israelite tribes to Assyria and replaced them with foreign populations whom he brought in from regions east of the land of Israel, such as Babylon and Kuta, settling them in the region of Samaria. The Bible goes on to describe how the new inhabitants were attacked by lions as a heavenly retribution for their failure to abide by the laws of the land. The king of Assyria then sent back one of the exiled Israelite priests from Samaria, who taught them to fear the God of Israel. However, the Bible relates that their acceptance of the God of Israel was incomplete, and that they formed a kind of syncretistic religion, which incorporated idolatrous practices, together with worshiping the God of Israel. They feared the Lord, yet they were serving their own gods, in accordance with the custom of the nations from among whom they had been taken into exile. Moreover, the ancient biblical commentator Rashi further elaborates that their incomplete worship of the God of Israel stemmed from the fact that they had only converted due to their fear of the attacking lions, and also because their adoption of the biblical faith was problematic from the very beginning, as they were taught by a priest of a high place from the northern Israelite kingdom, whose own religious practices were tainted with idolatry. Secondly, although the Samaritans ostensibly accepted the 5 books of Moses, they made some major changes, even distortions to the text, and they had not at all acknowledged the rest of the Holy Scriptures, including the works of the prophets. Thirdly, they replaced the sanctity of Jerusalem with Mount Gerizim near Shechem, upon which they built a temple as early as the 5th century BCE. This refusal to recognize the sanctity of Jerusalem was accordingly also a rejection of the authority of the house of David. Lastly, the Samaritans did not accept the oral Torah and the authority of the sages of Israel. It was this latter aspect, their failure to recognize and accept the authority of the Torah's oral law, that was perhaps the primary issue prompting Ezra to change the script, with the purpose of creating a clear distinction between them and the Jewish people. For it was specifically during Ezra's time, the period following the destruction of the first temple and the dawn of the second temple, that the aspect of Torah knowledge known as the oral law had become more pertinent than ever before. According to the sages of Israel, the changing of the Torah script was predestined from the very creation of the universe and foreseen in the Torah. Based upon a verse found in the book of Deuteronomy, the talmudic teaching we've been referencing states that the changing of the Torah script had actually been part of a divine plan all along. And it is written regarding the king of Israel that he shall write for himself a secondary Torah, Since the word change, shinui, finds a common root origin with the word secondary, mishneh, the Talmud learns that the original Torah was written in a script that was destined to be changed. This teaching alludes to the idea that the changing of the Torah script reflected more than a mere change of character fonts, but rather a major shift of epochs, which had occurred not only in history, but on a cosmic spiritual scale. But what was the nature of this change, and how is it connected to the changing of the script? Together with the immense geopolitical shifts that impacted the Jewish people at the dawn of the Second Temple period, there also came a major crisis of spiritual leadership. The destruction of the First Temple brought about an end to a glorious spiritual epoch in the history of the nation of Israel. It had been a time in which the Ark of the Covenant rested in the Holy of Holies, attesting to the divine presence and to a direct channel of communication that existed between heaven and earth. Accordingly, it was a time in which the prophets of Israel provided clear divine guidance to those who sought it. In contrast, it was the Ark of the Covenant that was most noticeably absent from the Second Temple. Similarly, Jewish tradition informs us that at the dawn of the Second Temple period, the last prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, delivered the final words of true prophetic revelation, after which the spirit of prophecy, along with the spiritual guidance it provided, ceased to exist. This left the nation of Israel in dire need for an alternative source of spiritual guidance. But what could replace prophecy? The Jewish tradition, as recorded in the Mishnah in the first chapter of the Ethics of the Fathers, teaches how the spiritual leadership and Torah-based authority was transmitted beginning with Moses and onwards. Moses received the Torah at Sinai and transmitted it to Joshua, Joshua to the elders, and the elders to the prophets, and the prophets to the men of the great assembly. It was the 120-member legislative body, known as the men of the great assembly, of which Ezra was a founding member, that had received its spiritual authority from the last of the prophets, and signaled the dawn of a new form of spiritual leadership that would fill the gap left by the prophets. It was a leadership based upon the wisdom of the sages of Israel. Thus, the dawn of the Second Temple period signaled a major shift of spiritual epochs. It was a shift from an era governed by prophecy to one governed by wisdom. This shift also represented a parallel transition that had occurred between two distinct aspects of the Torah, a transition that was echoed in the change of its very characters. By its very nature as a covenant, a two-way contract between God and the nation of Israel, the Torah includes two primary aspects, namely that of the bestower and that of the recipient. The aspect of the bestower relates to the divine origin and eternal nature of the Torah, as manifest through the 5 books of Moses, also called the written Torah, which was transmitted through prophetic revelation. The aspect of the recipient relates to man's role in the acquiring of Torah knowledge, as manifest through what is known as the oral Torah. The oral Torah, also known as the oral tradition, is the aspect of the Torah that is dynamic and evolving, to which mankind is a key contributor. It denotes not only the body of knowledge that delineates the many details regarding the fulfillment of the biblical commandments and the deeper secrets hidden within the written Torah, it represents the very vehicle through which the wisdom of the Torah is transferred to all aspects of daily life. Indeed, it is what establishes the very foundation upon which the nation of Israel stands. Thus, the change of spiritual epochs reflected a shift from the domain of prophecy and the divinely inspired written Torah to the role of the sages as the guardians of the divine law through the wisdom of the oral Torah. But how is this change of epochs connected to the changing of the script? To answer this question, let us refer to an additional teaching of the sages of Israel found in tractate Zvachim. The sage Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says, 3 prophets ascended with the Jewish people from the exile, one who testified to them about the altar and about the location of the altar, and one who testified to them that one sacrifices offerings even if there is no temple, and one who testified to them about the Torah, and instructed that it be written in Assyrian script. This additional tradition, which states that the changing of the Torah script was authorized by one of the last 3 prophets, does not contradict the teaching that states that Ezra was behind the changing of the script, but rather contributes to our wider understanding of the event. Together, the 2 traditions point to the changing of the script as the very event in which the 2 spiritual epochs at the dawn of the Second Temple period come together. On the one hand, the changing of the script was initiated by Ezra, a Torah sage and founder of the Men of the Great Assembly, which signified the epoch of wisdom, while, on the other hand, we learn that Ezra's action was endorsed by one of the last prophets, who testified that the Torah should be written in Assyrian script. Thus, the very act of changing the script was in itself a merging of the prophetic and wisdom epochs, and therefore reflected the transition between the 2. The original Hebrew script, associated with prophecy, was replaced by the Assyrian script, which symbolized the age of wisdom and the oral law. The Hebrew script now belonged to the past, to an age when prophecy guided the people. The Assyrian script, on the other hand, represented the future, a time when wisdom, learning, and human interpretation would define Jewish life for centuries to come. This fact is the very reason that the Hebrew script was left in the hands of the Samaritans. Since the Hebrew script was pertinent only to the age of prophecy, it became obsolete in the next era, having lost its original significance. Consequently, the fact that the Samaritans had held on to it attested to the fact that they adhered only to the written Torah, and were thus stuck in the previous epoch, clinging to a reality that no longer existed. In the film Origins, where we first introduced the foundational teaching in Tractate Sanhedrin regarding the script in which the Torah was originally written, we noted that the sages of Israel held to several different opinions, and that in presenting this teaching, we opted for the opinion that seemed most consistent with the historical facts. But what about the other opinions? Those that don't seem to be consistent with the facts we've covered, or even appear to be contradictory to them? Perhaps these opinions as well may reveal certain aspects or deeper layers of meaning regarding the Hebrew script. The notion of finding aspects of truth in seemingly contradictory opinions found within Torah scholarship is a well-known concept referred to as the 70 faces of Torah. This concept reflects the idea that the wisdom of the Torah is multifaceted and multi-layered, encompassing all aspects and dimensions of reality. One such opinion is that attributed to the great 2nd century sage Rabbi Elazar Hamodai, who is said to have stated, quite puzzlingly, that the script of the Torah actually never changed at all. Building upon a verse found in Exodus 27 regarding the hooks of the pillars that held up the tabernacle, the sage Rabbi Elazar Hamodai teaches that as the pillars supporting the tabernacle haven't changed, neither did the pillars' hooks, vavim in Hebrew, change. To appreciate this teaching, we must understand the significance of the Hebrew letter vav. The literal meaning of the word vav in Hebrew is hook, as in something that can attach one thing to another, and indeed the letter vav, as it appeared in the original pictographic alphabet, derived its meaning from its image, shaped like a shaft or a pillar with a hook, a vav, attached to it. In the Hebrew language, when the letter vav is added to the beginning of any word, it functions as the conjunctive vav, which denotes the word and, linking words, phrases, and ideas, and binding them together into a cohesive sentence. Likewise, in its spiritual essence, the letter vav represents the numerical value of 6, which also signifies connection. This is evident, for example, in the Mishnah, the primary text of the oral tradition, which is arranged in 6 orders. These 6 orders connect between the verses of the written Torah and the many details regarding the fulfillment of the biblical commandments delineated within the oral tradition, creating a single, unified body of knowledge. Similarly, the 7-branch menorah was comprised of 6 branches, which connected to a single shaft. And likewise, the very creation of the universe consisted of 6 days of creation, connected to the Sabbath. Thus, what Rabbi Elazar Hamodai expresses in his teaching is that, at its core, the Hebrew alphabet was never really replaced, as there is a perennial essence which connects between the various scripts. This is because the alphabetic letters are simply visual symbols, each one of which command a particular consonant or sound. And as the centuries went by and these symbols had evolved and transformed, they continued to follow the same linguistic rules and hadn't altered the way a sound was actually pronounced. Indeed, for those in command of the Hebrew language, the various script changes would be akin to an English speaker transitioning between print and cursive writing, or changing fonts in a word processor. Rabbi Elazar Hamodai's reference to the hooks of the pillars is a profound metaphor. Just as the pillars supporting the tabernacle are unchanging, so too the Vav remains a constant connector throughout the evolution of the Hebrew alphabet, demonstrating that the fundamental essence of the language remains intact regardless of its changing forms. This becomes readily apparent when studying the transformation of the alphabetic letters, beginning with the original alphabet, the so-called Proto-Sinaitic alphabet, through the subsequent Paleo-Hebrew, the various phases of Aramaic and its derivatives, and up until modern Hebrew. We notice that the letter Vav is one of the letters, if not the letter, displaying the least morphological change and thus serves as the symbolic and linguistic link between the various stages of the Hebrew alphabet. In an additional teaching demonstrating the multifaceted meaning found within the Torah, the Talmud teaches, based on a play on words, that other than the historical circumstances behind the term Assyrian script and its association with the Assyrian Empire, which we related earlier, the term also reflects the fact that it is a valid writing system. Why is it called Ashurit, Assyrian script? Because it is me'usheret in writing, meaning that it is both an efficient as well as an official or authorized script. Indeed, Ezra's changing of the script to a writing system that was also an official, international, and administrative means of communication surely helped bolster the Torah's authoritative status in the eyes of the people by linking it with the established and widely recognized official script of the Persian Empire. But not only was this an official script, it was also an efficient one, which was easier to master and use. This shift not only made the Torah more accessible, but also elevated the status of the written word in Jewish culture and helped the Jewish people become the literate and learned society who came to be known as the people of the book. About 200 years after the time of Ezra, during the 3rd century BCE, the Aramaic script had undergone yet another stage of transformation, in which it had developed into characters that are unique only to the Jewish people. The transformation from the earlier Aramaic script to what is known as the square script involved changes in letter shapes and proportions, and it became more structured and stylized. These changes allowed for the script to not only be even more readable and practical, but also more aesthetically pleasing. This was the script in which most of the Dead Sea Scrolls were written, and represents the direct predecessor of modern Hebrew characters. It is the script that eventually reached its peak of beauty and perfection in the stam calligraphy characters used in the writing of Torah scrolls today. It is the script taught to Jewish children as they memorize the Aleph Bet, and the script with which millions of pages of Torah scholarship have been recorded and continue to be on a daily basis. In closing, if the changing of the script teaches us anything, it is that content is more important than outer appearances. And while the external aspects of the Torah may evolve or change, the essence of the Torah remains constant. That at its core, the Torah reflects a divine, timeless wisdom that is unaffected by wavering external circumstances, and that rather than the Torah itself undergoing change, it is we, the readers and learners, who are transformed by its eternal wisdom. Lastly, the reason the mystical secrets of the Hebrew letters are derived specifically from the later Aramaic, so-called Assyrian characters, is because they are the letters through which the oral Torah is transmitted. And it is only through the oral tradition, through its letters, through its words, and through its sacred teachings handed down from generation to generation, that the nation of Israel carries forward the timeless mission to bring to light the secrets of creation to all of humanity.